They called it the Ledger of Shadows, 237 names, each one followed by 2 words, acquisition complete. That book was never meant to be found. They say history is written by the victors, but sometimes history is unwritten by them too, shredded, sealed beneath floorboards, and buried beneath generations of silence. In 2018, in the rotten bones of Salem's oldest meeting house, a forgotten journal was discovered by accident during a routine foundation inspection. It was leather-bound, water-damaged, and hidden beneath the pulpit floor. Its entries were not official church records, no baptisms, no sermons, no marriages, only names, dates, valuations, and cryptic notes beside each one. You've heard of the Salem witch trials, but you've never heard of this. Because this is the story of the Blackwell family, 3 brothers who stood not beside the flames of hysteria, but behind them. They didn't fear the devil, they used him. Judge Ezekiel Blackwell, Reverend Nathaniel Blackwell, and Sheriff Josiah Blackwell. Together, they ruled Salem not as civil servants, but as something far darker. Architects of a conspiracy that transformed fear into empire, faith into wealth, law into execution. History tells us 19 people were hanged for witchcraft in 1692. But this journal, this unholy ledger, documents 237. Most were never tried. Most were never even seen again. Their land, their homes, their livestock, their debts, systematically transferred into Blackwell hands. This wasn't justice, it was erasure. It was real estate cloaked in righteousness. And the most chilling entry. October 1720, Mercy Blackwell, family matter resolved. This is not a ghost story. It's a financial report written in blood. You're about to see how an entire town was turned into a machine of acquisition, how American soil was soaked not just in fear, but in fraud, and why the descendants of these men stayed. Will control 40% of Salem's historic district today. This story is not safe. You're not supposed to know it, but now you do, and once you start pulling this thread, you might never stop unraveling. They didn't burn the witches in Salem, that's the first lie. They hanged them, quietly, legally, efficiently, because fire is spectacle, but a rope is paperwork, and the Blackwells were never interested in noise. In the winter of 1692, Salem village was already cracking under the weight of its own fear. A brutal winter had emptied the granaries, disease moved faster than prayer, children cried in their sleep for reasons no medicine could explain. But none of it, compared to the fear the people had for each other. Into that chaos stepped the 3 Blackwell brothers. Judge Ezekiel, nearly 50, his eyes as cold as the iron scales of justice he claimed to serve. Reverend Nathaniel, gaunt and trembling with what he called holy fire, his voice turning guilt into thunder. And Sheriff Josiah, brutal, silent, and always carrying a walking stick carved from wood no local tree had ever grown. These men didn't enforce order, they sculpted it. But understand this, they didn't create the hysteria, they simply aimed it. The first accusations came from young girls, Betty Paris, Abigail Williams, names preserved in dusty schoolbooks. They writhed, screamed, named names. A woman with a mole, a man with a shadow too long, a mother who kept her curtains closed too tightly. All it took was a whisper. But when Goody Bridget Bishop was arrested, something strange happened. Her property was seized, not by the town, not by the court, but by Judge Blackwell himself. Transferred, held in trust, for the good of the colony. That wasn't supposed to happen. Then came the widow Porter. She owned riverside land the Blackwells had tried to buy for years. She refused, said it wasn't for sale, said her late husband's hands were still in the soil. A week later, she was in chains. She didn't sell her land. She screamed it away. By spring, the pattern was clear, but only if you were CE. Lose enough to see it. Accused witches weren't just outcasts. They were landowners, mill operators, rivals, and their land, their homes, their debt, all of it was quietly vacuumed into the Blackwell estate ledger. The trials were theatre. The real ritual was legal transfer. So ask yourself this: What do you call a crime that disguises itself as law? And what happens when the law is controlled by a single family? You don't see blood, you see signatures. Mercy Blackwell was 16 years old when she began to see the truth. She was Ezekiel's daughter, raised in the shadow of the courthouse, in the echo of sermons, in a house where every wall had ears and every silence had purpose. Her mother died in childbirth, and so she was passed between uncles like a ledger too precious to lose. They gave her an education unusual for a girl, reading, writing, Latin, and record-keeping, always record-keeping. They told her it was a sacred duty, document the souls baptized, the marriages performed, the debts paid, the deaths mourned. But when Reverend Nathaniel asked her to keep a second book, one hidden in his study, one she was forbidden to speak of, something inside her began to whisper back. It was a whisper Mercy would spend the next year trying to ignore. She copied names, she transcribed confessions, she wrote words like delivered and cleansed and restored. But in that hidden ledger, she also began seeing entries with no sermon attached, no baptism, no funeral, just property valuations, just names crossed out, just 2 words: acquisition complete. Mercy never asked questions, she wasn't that foolish, but she began to watch. She watched when her uncle Ezekiel presided over trials that lasted less than an hour. She watched as Reverend Nathaniel accused people in his Sunday sermons by implication alone, weaving vague sins into parables that led to real arrests. And she watched her Uncle Josiah ride out in the dead of night, always returning with another face behind bars, another neighbor vanished, another rival stripped of land and title. But what haunted her most were the sounds. At night, when the town slept and the wolves howled beyond the tree line, Mercy would hear her father's voice, low, urgent, angry, and she would hear her uncles respond. They didn't speak of God. They spoke of parcels, access, ownership, obstruction. They didn't fear witches. They feared delay, and they planned, not judgments, but acquisitions. Then came the night she overheard them discuss the widow Porter. She refused to sell to me twice now, Josiah growled. Perhaps, Nathaniel said coldly, the widow will face other troubles. A chill deeper than winter cut through Mercy that night. 2 weeks later, widow Porter was dragged from her home and labeled a witch. Mercy watched, and she wrote, because somewhere deep in her blood, a fire had been lit. Not of fear, not of guilt, but of something the Blackwells had never expected. Awareness. It was June 10th, 1692, when Mercy watched a woman die for the first time. Bridget Bishop, the first public execution of the Salem trials. Mercy stood at a distance near the edge of the crowd gathered at what would later be called Gallows Hill, but to Mercy it was just an open slope and a tree with a rope. The noose creaked in the wind as if the earth itself was protesting. Bridget didn't scream, she prayed. Even when the trap was sprung, even when her body twitched in the noonday sun, there was no thunder, no omen, just silence, just finality. Mercy turned her face away, not out of horror, but out of knowing, because she'd read the ledger 2 nights before. Bridget Bishop's name had already been crossed out. Acquisition complete. Her tavern, her orchard, her silver, her debts, all transferred to Judge Ezekiel Blackwell. Before the trial ever began, Mercy had broken into her uncle's study with a key she made herself, a small thing, shaved from brass in secret, filed under moonlight. The ledger had waited for her like an open mouth, eager to speak, and what it said shook her to her core. There weren't 10 names, or 20. There were hundreds. And not just names, detailed inventories, assets, debts, maps, instructions for acquisition, plans for discrediting, notes about resistance, and beside certain names, chilling phrases like handled privately, escaped but terminated, swamp disposal. This wasn't opportunism. This was design. A system, and at its center were the Blackwell brothers, conducting trials by day and seizures by night. Righteousness was the mask. Real estate was the motive. Fear was the fuel. Mercy didn't sleep that night. She copied pages, dozens of them, and she hid them beneath the loose floorboard under her bed, the same floorboard her mother once walked before she died, giving birth to a girl who now held the most dangerous secret in Saley. And with each passing day, more names were added, more neighbors vanished, more property changed hands. The town believed the devil walked among them. They were right, but he wore a black robe. He delivered sermons. He ruled from the bench, and no one suspected he sat at their own dinner tables. Not yet, but Mercy did, and she was no longer just recording history. She was preparing for war. By July, the ledger was growing faster than the cemetery. What began as scattered accusations had become a harvest. Every week, new names, some whispered at sermons, others dragged from their homes by night, appeared both in the courtroom and in the private Blackwell book. Mercy kept copying. Each night, she opened the drawer in her uncle's desk, using the key she had shaped from a brooch clasp. Each night, she added to her growing archive, copied ledgers, maps, letters, and the chilling shorthand her uncles used to mask their crimes. One symbol, in particular, appeared over and over again, a sigil, crudely etched, always beside entries marked for immediate execution, a twisted triangle inside a circle, punctured at the center. It was not Latin, not Greek, not known to any scripture Mercy had ever read. But it meant death. She knew that much. Her cousin William noticed she wasn't sleeping. He was Sheriff Josiah's only son, 2 years older than Mercy, quiet, obedient, but with eyes that sometimes softened when he saw her writing late by candlelight. "You should rest," he said one night, leaning in the doorway of her room. Mercy looked up slowly, hand still clutching her quill. "Do you ever wonder how many are truly guilty?" William hesitated. "That's not for us to decide." "No," she said. "That's the problem." He left without another word. That night, Mercy delivered food to the jail as she often did, but instead of leaving it with the guard, she insisted on handing it to the prisoners herself. She lingered, long enough to slip scraps of charcoal and torn paper into the hands of the accused. "Write what they've done," she whispered. "I'll come back." They stared at her like she was mad. Maybe she was, but madness was safer than silence. By the next morning, Reverend Nathaniel had already delivered another fiery sermon about hidden agents of the enemy masquerading as servants of virtue. He spoke of how even family could be corrupted by sympathy for the devil, and how betrayal was more dangerous than any witch. He never looked at Mercy during the sermon, but she knew it was meant for her. Her time was running out. She could feel it, and if she were to survive, if any truth were to outlive the Blackwell machine, she would need more than documents. She would need someone to believe her, someone outside, someone powerful enough to stop them. The plan was simple and nearly suicidal. Mercy would deliver evidence, real evidence, to Governor William Phipps in Boston. Not the rumors, not the hysteria, but documented theft, orchestrated executions, and a conspiracy so deeply rooted it had infected the core of the colony's justice system. She knew the route. She knew the timing. She also knew that if she were caught, she'd vanish like the others. But there was no more time. The Blackwell brothers had created a list titled Final Acquisitions. 17 names, 17 families, all of them wealthy, all of them inconvenient, all of them marked with the Blackwell sigil of termination. They weren't just securing land, they were preparing to own Salem itself. Mercy returned to the cellar beneath the meeting house. She'd found an old storage niche there weeks before, small, cold, forgotten. She stashed the copied pages inside a weather-worn sack wrapped in layers of cloth. If she failed, it would all be found, eventually. That night, William came to her room. "I've seen the list," he said, his voice low and shaking. "They're planning to move fast, by the end of the month." "Then we don't have until the end of the month," Mercy replied. She showed him the documents, pages covered in her neat handwriting. Exact replicas of the Blackwell ledger entries, not speculation. Proof. He ran his fingers across the ink like it burned. "If I create a diversion," he whispered, "you could get out. I know trails that bypass the sheriff's men." "Why would you help me?" Mercy asked. He didn't answer immediately, just stared into the firelight like a boy trying to remember his soul. "Because I followed my father 2 nights ago," he said at last. He and 2 deputies carried a bundle into the woods. It looked heavy, like a body. I watched them bury it without a prayer. When they came back, they were laughing. Mercy said nothing. But in that silence, an alliance was forged, built not on love or blood, but on the shared horror of truth. They would act the following night. William would set fire to the northern barn, far enough from town to cause alarm, not danger, and while eyes were on the flames, Mercy would ride south on a borrowed horse under cloak of smoke and dusk. If she made it to Boston, everything could change. If not, she'd disappear from the records like all the others.